This class looks at the early 20th century, specifically at the movement that occurs in reaction to the events of World War I, as well as the further developments in modern architecture and the response to the war. World War I, at the time known as the Great War, broke out in 1914 thanks to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Right, the Austria-Hungary is going to declare war on Serbia. In turn, the colonial empires had allegiances that one after another declared war on each other, which would last until 1918. Now, in this war that set the Allied powers against the Central powers, we're going to have a dress rehearsal for World War II, whereas Great Britain and France are going to be pitted against Germany and Austria-Hungary, as well as the Ottoman Empire. The United States will join the war towards the end. Now, the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy will again in World War II join forces against, again, Russia, France, and Great Britain, whereas the U.S., as in World War II, joins nearly the last year in 1917. Now, this war is going to be called the War to End All Wars because it is the first one where we see mechanization being used, that being the first war that ever used tanks, machine guns, chemical warfare, gas masks, trench warfare, all of these new technologies used for mass homicide as some individuals saw it. 70 million men in total will be mobilized, and 15 million of those will die in this war, more casualties than any other war in human history. Now, trench warfare illustrates the very barbaric way in which soldiers had to encounter this new technology that could, with such ferocity, mow down many more individuals and cause casualties than ever before, thanks to technology. Now, this technology, which had promised the world progress, which the futurists believe would lead to a new utopia, where we would live in high-rises and ride in automobiles and fly in airplanes, instead turned into a dystopian nightmare, as we find millions of individuals are senselessly led to their deaths, seemingly at the time, many thinkers believe. Now, to give you an example of the extent of this death, in one single battle, not the war, but in one battle, that of the Battle of Somme, we have over 1 million casualties alone. This is an amazing number, which would be unthinkable in the ancient world if we think of the battlefields of Alexander the Great, or those great battles of the Spartans that, of course, are going to come down to us in lore. Nothing is going to compare to the scale of death seen in this war. Now, the younger generation, who is primarily fighting in the war, sees it as, quote, an insane spectacle of collective homicide. They did not know why they were dying. They didn't understand the principles behind these political allegiances and the colonial aspects that were at stake. Instead, they saw that they were being called by the older generation to die pitifully and pointlessly on the battlefields of Western Europe. Now, we find that artists are already going to, from the Expressionist side, comment on the seemingly existentialist angst and dilemma that leads to this feeling of hopelessness and that there is no point to the war, to where we have many of them engaging in political satire against the various governments of England, France, and Germany. Now, the neutral nations, including Switzerland, which would again remain neutral in World War II, are going to be a gathering ground for deserters, or the ones that are called deserters, who refuse to fight anymore and suffer from conditions that they knew at the time called shell shock, or what we now refer to as post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, the movement that comes out of World War I is one of illogical anarchy, one that protests the war, that does not understand the point of it. And that is where Dada is going to find its derivation. Beginning in Zurich here in Switzerland, it will spread rapidly as an anti-art movement across the world, from New York to Berlin, making its way all the way to Japan. Now, this is where we're going to find reason and logic, they believed, caused the World War. And it makes sense because technology had made possible the ability to slaughter human beings on a scale never seen before as they understood it. So obviously, salvation rests in political anarchy, irrationality, and intuition. And that is also one of the origin stories for where Dada gets its name, that being tearing up random letters, putting them in a bag, and pulling them out nonsensically. Hence, you get Dada, a nonsensical system, an assembly of letters. Now, the anti-war nature of Dada is the raison d'etre, the reason to be, from 1916 until 1922. They are going to begin their performances in literature, poetry, theater, and then in the visual arts and art manifestos. They primarily will use these venues and these media to mock the authority of the governments that they believe led these young men to their deaths, and the church which justified this collective homicide as they saw it. Zurich Dada is going to be the first movement that occurs in Switzerland, where these self-proclaimed iconoclasts, or breakers of icons, will reject the ideas and values that Europeans treasured, such as their institutions, political and religious. Each are going to be seen as having contributed to the death drunkenness, as it is going to be defined by Hugo Ball in one of his spoken word illogical presentations here at the Café Voltaire, right, which is where they're going to meet in Zurich. So you find that this anti-art protest movement would perform, right, the illogical ramblings that are meant to undermine how illogical people are acting in the war, sending all of these men to their deaths for no reason at all. So be sure to watch the link of one of these spoken word performances, these very illogical ramblings whereby Hugo Ball would dress up like a bishop in a cardboard outfit and ramble on nonsensically with letters that are pulled randomly out of a bag. Right, from these letters, these verses that were cut up rather illogically and irrationally, put together to make these nonsensical, non sequitur, monosyllabic and multisyllabic verses that are completely irrational. Thus, of course, showing how they questioned rationality and enlightened civilized society that could possibly send millions of men to their deaths. So they're going to be questioning it with the irony, satire, and improvisation meant to shock the public into recognizing these contradictions of culture. So Dada, as a definition of meaningless gibberish, can be understood best as a harlequinade made of nothingness. There is no point to Dada other than undermining irrationality and undermining these institutions. So in these performances, much like the spoken word verses you just heard, we would have many of the Dada practitioners performing inebriated dances, music, poetry readings, which they called noise performances, where multiple inebriated or drunken performers would talk over each other. Now, turning to France, Dada is going to find one of its most famous practitioners, not in Switzerland, but instead in Paris. That of Marcel Duchamp. And Marcel Duchamp is an established academic artist of the day who will be the most famous early Dadaist, producing what is otherwise known as anti-art art, attacking the establishment and institutions that are ensconced in this tradition that they believe led people to their deaths. And that is Parisian Dada, as you see here in his famous LHOOQ of 1919. In the image, we have a postcard that he has purchased of the Mona Lisa, a painting in the Louvre, where he has drawn a mustache and goatee and written the letters LHOOQ at the bottom. So in it, we are illustrating a new approach to art, in that we are rejecting traditional art forms. For he did not paint this. He did not create this as a unique work of art. Instead, he co-opted, took an existing mass-produced object, modified it slightly, and then introduced it into a new context, to where it has a new interpretation. So what we are doing is taking something that everyone is familiar with, a reproduction of the most famous painting in the world at the time, the Mona Lisa, painted by Leonardo da Vinci, at this time considered one of the old masters, or one of the greats of the High Renaissance, and he is making fun of it, lampooning it, deriding it, mocking it by drawing in a childish fashion a mustache and a goatee on it. Right, so we find this is going to be otherwise rejecting that traditional understanding that art must be a skillful manipulation of materials. For number one, he did not create this. He purchased it and modified a pre-existing mass-produced object. Now, at the time, we must remember the theft of the Mona Lisa from the Louvre by an Italian national in 1911 was world news. Returned in 1913, it was in the papers for 2 years straight, leading up to World War II. One of the great art thefts of history, making this the most famous painting in the world. And to this day, we have people flocking from Asia, the Americas, Africa, all over to the Louvre to see this painting. Now, what we find here with this disdain for convention, this derisive iconoclasm, mocking the tradition that led to the Mona Lisa becoming the most famous work in history, is a mondegreen, that being a near homophony, whereby if we say aloud the letters spelled out here, LHOOQ in French, that being the French pronunciation of the letters, LHOOQ, you'll notice that it means something very different, very tongue-in-cheek, that people would recognize at the time, saying it aloud repeatedly, like many games we have today. It means she's got a hot ass, quite obviously and literally. So there is also a more subtle interpretation, the sexual innuendo, she has a fire down below, and or she is going to be sexually aroused. So we find that now not only are we going to be pointing out and mocking the fact that the Mona Lisa should not be held up as this beacon of fine art, but also mocking the supposed homosexuality of its maker, Leonardo da Vinci, in the recent study by Freud at the time. So in either way you are going to interpret this, it is certainly not holding this painting up to the reverential treatment expected of it by art historians of the day. Now this leads to Duchamp practicing this approach with his ready-mades elsewhere, first in 1913, where he will take found objects that he calls ready-mades, which are mass-produced utilitarian objects that he will reintroduce as art. The most famous example of which is here in his fountain, that like his postcard of the Mona Lisa, he did not create. He's going to go to a corner plumbing store and purchase this urinal and write on it Armut 1917. He then submits it in a juried art exhibition where he himself is a juror in 1917 to the Society of Independent Artists in New York. Now, he argues in the defense of this work that its artfulness is not in the skillful manipulation of the medium of the artist, but instead the fact that the artist recognized this as a work of art. Of course, when it's brought before the jurors, they mock it mercilessly and are scornful, disdainful, and otherwise suspect that someone would insult them by suggesting that a urinal would be art. Duchamp then, in the test case for 20th century art, moves us in a new direction in this defense. right? His defense being whether Mr. Mutt, with his own hands, made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it, Duchamp states. So we must take from this the notion that the artist knows what's art because of the concept behind it. The idea is what is important, not in his ability to manipulate the medium. And this takes us in a radically new direction in the 20th century, eventually leading us to ideas like conceptual art, performance art, those in which there are no actual product or material to be had in the end goal. So this is going to have several incarnations, and he makes many versions of it, selling it to different museums. And today, of course, those original jurors would be horrified to know that it does sit in museums on a pedestal with a frame that actually states artist title date on it. It is part of the establishment, part of the canon of art history now because of how significant the idea was. So whether or not you agree with the fact that a postcard or a urinal is going to be considered art, it nevertheless moves us in a new avenue, a new direction, unfettered by convention, and opens up new possibilities for artists that were hitherto not possible, stating that the ideas that people have are more significant than the product they come up with, which foretells postmodernism in the post-industrial age. For most of us today in the United States do not, in fact, manufacture anything or create anything, but we are going to broker in ideas. Turning to Berlin Dada, or Berliner Dada, during the Weimar Republic, which is going to be the establishment set up by the Allies after the defeat of Germany in World War I that will last as a puppet government until the Nazis take over in 1933. During this time, Germans are very disenfranchised about their country and their way of life because the Allies were ruling over them. They felt humiliated from the First World War. There was rampant inflation and many political issues. That is why Berliner Dada is going to be much more politically charged and obviously charged than that of Parisian Dada. So here we're going to have Kurt Schwitters in his Metzbild 5b, or Picture a Red Heart Church, of April 26, 1919, which is actually a collage. Remember that a collage is going to be made up of scraps of paper in which you're going to find he paints tempera on top of it along with crayon on cardboard. Now, collages are not new. We looked at them during Cubism with the work of synthetic Cubism. So we are generally going to take non-art objects and assemble them on the surface, generally gluing them to a flat surface. And you can, as in this example, modify it in many ways, in this case with crayons and tempera. Now, this is otherwise known as junk art, another type of Dada art like ready-mades that takes everyday objects. In this case, the Dadaesque reuse of refuse or trash from modern society. In this case, of course, it is political because Berliner Dada is always more political than that of the Parisian or Zurich Dada, directly citing, in this instance, a newspaper that mentions the slaughter of socialist partisans in Bremen and their fascist rivals, thus directly linking art to politics and protest in the case of Dada. Dada is inherently political. Now, this again is reusing the ready-made, the everyday, the mass-produced, thus undermining the notion of originality and creativity that is so central to Western art in the academic tradition. Now, the principles in Dada here align with that of Futurism and Cubism, but politicizes it. So we still have abstract designs, geometric elements, overlapping fractured planes, but now not for the sake of investigating the temporal notion of reality or the different sides of the same object, but instead to promote anarchy and anti-government sentiment. Now, the most politically famous example of Berliner Dada is actually going to take place in the first International Dada Fair in 1920 in Berlin, where political satire is taken to new heights. Over 200 works of Dada were on sale there for anyone who paid the entry price, thus demonetizing the art. So if you walked in paying the fee to look at this art, you could then walk out with any of these examples. Thus the opposite of the art world, undermining the traditional notion of the value of a work of art that is original and carefully crafted. Now, where this is located, interestingly enough, and the most famous example being what is highlighted here in the upper right-hand corner, is going to be placing this anti-government, anti-military exhibition right next to a military recruiting center. So just like today, where they have recruiting centers across the United States, imagine having an exhibition mocking it right next door. Obviously, they were shut down, fined, and many of them imprisoned for this. Of course, one can see why with the most notorious entry. Someone did not even sign it, being a dummy with a pig's head dressed in a German military uniform. A very anti-military statement, and also a very anti-war statement following World War I, protesting it and then demanding that it never happen again. Now, the anti-war sentiment also has political and feminist bents thanks to Hannah Höch, seen in the lower right-hand corner here with her cane. In her photo montage, we have the cut with the kitchen knife Dada through the last Weimar beer belly cultural epic of Germany, thus showing us what she hopes Dada as a movement will do to the Weimar Republic. That being, Dada is here used as a weapon, like a kitchen knife, to cut the fat beer belly of the Allies as a puppet government set up in Weimar. So we find here with her photo montage, she cuts out images from newspapers and magazines, mass-produced objects again, like we just looked at with, again, Svitters and with, once again, Duchamp. In this case, used for feminist and political ends. In it, we have famous political and military figures with their heads on belly dancers or exotic strippers, or standing on the heads of others, literally showing how they got into their position by stepping on others. A very unflattering presentation and bit of political and social satire. Additionally, we have a photograph of the artist here boarding a ship with a map showing women's enfranchisement across Europe, that being the countries that allowed women to vote, to own property, to inherit property from their family, to choose their own husbands. Now, this may seem quaint to everyone now, but it must be remembered that American women could not vote until 1920 with the 19th Amendment, after World War I. Only then did women's suffrage take effect and women could actually vote. So we were among one of the last nations to allow women to vote in the Western world. Now, turning to the last two examples that we have here, let's talk about what happens with modern architecture and the other response in post-World War I, where we find that instead of the anarchist reaction of Dada, we have the demand that we should use reason and rationality to solve our issues and differences. Now, this comes by way of modern architecture, which will evolve into the international style of 1910 to 1930, overlapping World War I. Now, this begins in Europe, even though the technology, as we have discussed, such as steel and reinforced concrete and elevators, have already been established in America. Now, this new international style of architecture, which is known as the modern style of architecture, considers building as an arrangement of useful spaces rather than as a mass. And we find that function of interior spaces is paramount. Functionalism becomes the name of the game. Form dictating function. What does the structure actually do? And so if it is unnecessary for the functioning of the structure, we do away with it. Anything unnecessary is stripped away. So now we have the modern industrial materials used in the international style of steel, reinforced concrete, and glass. Other buildings, right, cloaked under a skin of stone or terracotta, are prior to the international style, are not part of this modernist movement. So we want to strip away everything but what modern structures are actually made of. Steel, reinforced concrete, glass. The early example of that in the first international style structure in the Steiner House by Adolf Loos of 1910 can be found in Vienna, Austria. In it, we have an austere arrangement of windows, square and rectangular shapes, and merely a concrete flat surface with the steel window frames and glass. There are no additional flourishes, sculptures, or arabesque patterns. There is nothing vegetal or organic about it. It is the opposite, the reaction against the Art Nouveau, which Loos and many other modernist international style designers will consider culturally degenerate. They find that it celebrates the jouissance and sexual promiscuity of the French coming from the Rococo. They want to move away from that, reject it, return to something that is rational, that only shows and uses what the structure is actually made of. So there are no curvilinear lines. There are no whiplash-like designs, no oceanic life. Instead, just straight lines and the materials of the modern world. So this is the opposite appearance of the exterior of the Horta house, right, that we have designed here by Victor Horta, which is going to undulate, moving with a curvilinear rhythm, growing much like those whiplash-like designs on the interior. Instead, we have a flat, unadorned, and very severe style. That reinforced concrete is much like what we looked at with the Wainwright building designed by Louis Sullivan. However, now we strip away those decorative terracotta elements that we have on the Wainwright building. It is a flat, unadorned cement exterior with, again, taupe grays and whites decorating it. Now, Charles-Édouard Jonnier, or Le Corbusier, is going to be one of the most famous architects in this period, practicing what he calls purism, that is going to illustrate these principles that he believes are necessary to bring Europe out of the ashes, that the war, he believed, was a great test, that we had to sacrifice to lead to more secure and harmonious future for Europe, and a design that is universally appreciated, a universal aesthetic that unites all of Europe, that Germany, France, Holland, Belgium, Italy, Spain, right, Portugal, England, all of these countries can appreciate the universal forms in purism as he considers it. So Le Corbusier is going to be influenced by Neoplatonism and this belief that there is an unchanging eternal reality behind the world of appearances that is constantly in flux, that we perceive by our senses, that we instead should seek this timeless classical harmony that is especially appreciated after the horrors of the war, after millions had died senselessly as they see it. We need something to bring everyone together. Out of this Neoplatonic interest for timelessness and universal aesthetics that anyone could appreciate in Europe was Le Corbusier's Villa Savoye. So the Villa Savoye, built in 1929 to 1930, is going to illustrate those simplified interplays of geometric forms, whereby we have these flat, reductive, abstract designs, void of any external ornament and or additional stucco, decorative facing, and anything organic like we found in the Art Nouveau. Instead, we're using his new domino construction system, whereby 6 steel supports are going to be placed in concrete slabs at the same locations. Thus, you find the different floors and the beams running through them resemble a domino. Now, because the load-bearing structure is going to be on the inside, the internal part of Le Corbusier's design here, we now have the ability to open up in a much more functional way the walls to do many more interesting things. That being the curtain walls, as they are known, are these non-load-bearing walls, because in the domino construction system, the steel supports are holding up the weight of the building. Therefore, you can have windows or put the walls on the inside wherever you would like. That being function dictating form here means that you can maximize the structure for a domestic interior living space or a workspace or an office space. All of this is made possible thanks to curtain walls. Now, on the interior of the structure, we have a very modern open plan to where walls do not divide the different rooms. Instead, we are left open with the massive walls that turn into windows to look out onto the trees and the forest beyond, giving you a very open and light effect, even though all we see in the structure are the modern building materials of steel, reinforced concrete, and glass. So here we have a great example of what Le Corbusier is going to be explaining his architecture to strive for, and that is to be a machine for living in. So this maximizes with machine-like efficiency what you can do with these new modern materials, and ensures that nothing goes to waste by way of the space and or the living areas in this particular instance. Now, to rebuild Europe's infrastructure, Le Corbusier is also going to, in the pavilion L'Esprit Nouveau, is going to introduce in 1925 an economical modular unit, which becomes the basis for 20th century urban housing, whereby we have the modular furniture, the designs, the cabinets, everything is interchangeable, leading to modern companies such as, in modern design, like we find in IKEA, for instance. Things that are very affordable, sleek, and are not defined by a particular region. This could be anywhere in the world, from Scandinavia to Spain to Europe to Asia to America. And it would be universally appreciated for that Neoplatonic approach to universal essences and form. Now, turning to America, we find the two greatest urban centers are going to be Chicago and New York, vying for one another during this period as architectural centers, each claiming to have the highest skyscraper, and still to this very day compete with one another over who has the largest structures. It is in Chicago that we find Frank Lloyd Wright, the most important American modernist architect working. Now, he went to engineering school at the University of Wisconsin and then spent 5 years with the Adler and Sullivan firm until he broke out on his own, starting his own architectural firm. Now, he specializes in domestic architecture, making very unique modernist structures in what will become known as the prairie style. Now, the prairie style of architecture is modern American architecture, whereby we have a design that's meant to imitate or echo the flat plains of the Midwest prairie. Hence, we're going to have low horizontal houses with flat roofs and overhanging eaves. So we have a cantilevered approach here that draws the eye out over the horizon, over a flat plain, instead of up with skyscrapers, so common in the international style. Now, in America, we find that the international style will not be adopted, that one that we just looked at by Le Corbusier and Loos and other European architects, and it will not be adopted till the post-war, till after America becomes a superpower and is going to identify itself as part of the world. Even in World War I, there was still an isolationist policy and a hesitation to get involved with European affairs, which repeats itself throughout American history until we are going to be dragged back into the affairs of the world and realize that America cannot isolate itself from these other concerns. Here in the Frederick C. Robbie House in Chicago, you have a great example of this prairie style, whereby, as with all of his structures, Frank Lloyd Wright is going to take into consideration the surrounding environment, the trees, the flat plains that would surround Chicago in the Midwest, all cantilevered to give the effect of an abstract structure that still has the brick and the very warm feeling associated with and appreciated with American architecture. So here, the roof dramatically cantilevers outwards, hiding the entrance and egress. The doorway into and out of the house, as well as the garage, is hidden from view. It is not easily found looking at it from the street. Now, it's meant to reflect that broad, flat approach of the prairie surrounding the Midwest as well, thus considering the environment in which the building would be seen. The interior is going to be inspired by Japanese architecture, for it lacks dividing walls, very similar to that international style modernist aesthetic produced by Le Corbusier we looked at a moment ago in the Villa Savoy. But now it is still going to include, as with Japanese architecture interior design, warm wood and organics. Now, the horizontal emphasis of the main living area is divided in two by a fireplace. The architecture, the inset lighting, the hand molding, all is going to be designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. He was not going to be designing the house and then let it be filled up with furniture that did not match his design. So he designed all. Now, this is very similar to those dividing walls and the rich, warm coloration of wood inside of Japanese interior decorative elements, such as the screen paintings that we will cover in non-Western art. Now, the interior is designed by him and is similar to that interest, in this case a much more Art Deco interest, but still an interest in geometric design that is going to dominate architecture from 1910 to 1920. And then with the Art Nouveau, expand even further into the machine aesthetic. Now, he is uninterested in the machine aesthetic on the exterior, though. He has not fully embraced, right, the industrial materials of steel, glass, and reinforced concrete. Instead, we still have the warm, traditional materials of wood and red brick, and of course, very skillfully integrating the architecture into the surrounding tree line and vegetation, all of which makes it feel very natural in place where it is seen in this given neighborhood. Now, turning to Kaz Gilbert, we have with the Woolworth Building, completed between 1911 and 1913 in New York, one of the leading skyscraper architects. So in 1900, New York is going to gain the lead in the number of tall skyscrapers over Chicago, and they will go back and forth trying to outdo one another ever since until this very day. Here we have the tallest building in the world at the time, not structure, for the Eiffel Tower is over 1,000 feet tall, but in this building that houses offices and living quarters, you have a height of nearly 792 feet, 55 floors, unheard of at this time, and made possible thanks to the elevator and, once again, central heating and cooling. So here we have the same type of steel frame skeleton where we have girders that hold up each one of the floors cast in concrete, very similar to the domino construction system used by Le Corbusier. And so we can see how the internal structure hangs. The exterior is going to be made up of curtain walls, just like modern architecture is in Europe. You can do whatever you want with the exterior, make them windows, block them off, turn it into an office space, living quarters, a wide open floor. You have this modular option. Now, the skyscraper is only made possible, and the early ones in New York, by way of elevators, right? And then, of course, the central heating and cooling, which finds its way into these buildings roughly in the 1920s and 30s. So this is going to circulate air because you cannot open windows above several stories tall because the wind gusts are too violent. And of course, there is the issue of people falling out or jumping out. And so that was something that the building architects needed to contend with. So just to show you how this works, they will have several insulated layers outside of the concrete slab flooring and the beams that actually hold it up. The elevators will always be at the back of a structure that setbacks or that's going to stair step backwards as we're moving from the base, a strong, heavy central base, to a smaller spire at the top. Now, this is still going to reject the utilitarian Chicago style in favor of the historicizing approach. Just like with Louis Sullivan's Wainwright building in St. Louis, you can see the decorative flourishes on the exterior. We do not only see, like the buildings around it that come along later in the international style, steel, glass, and reinforced concrete. Instead, the historicizing approach means that it's meant to look like architecture from the past. Namely, Gothic architecture with these spires that are going to emphasize verticality, the one architectural style that's whole raison d'etre, or reason to be, was to challenge the vertical limitations of buildings, making their way to the heights of the gods. In the case of modern architecture here, we're using that reference to Gothic style because it emphasizes verticality. So the formal elements tell us what the purpose of this building is, and that is to showcase the power and wealth of New York and America in general by extension, and the competition it had with the other main American city in Chicago. This lecture looks at art between the world wars, and will focus on the two trends that we noted ever since post-impressionism, that being one, emphasizing the expressionistic route, like that of Van Gogh and Gauguin, while the other the analytical route, like Cezanne and Seurat. Last class, during World War I, we noted those two trends in the rather expressionistic and emotional approach of Dada, seeking to undermine institutions and destroy art and embrace anarchy, versus the rather analytical and logical approach of modernist architecture in the international style. Here, we will look at the two centers for this rather rational approach, that being Holland and then Berlin and Germany. Here we find the rather rational approach carrying on from Le Corbusier's purism in the post-Netherlandish style, aptly called the Stijl, or the style, from the Dutch. The two founders and practitioners being Theo van Doesburg and Piet Mondrian. They sought an impersonal, universal set of principles that would unite Europe post-war, just as Le Corbusier had hoped his architecture and interior design would do. Now, the theoretical leader of the group, Van Doesburg, will write several tracts and publish a journal called De Stijl. Now, his ideas derive from his time in the Dutch army, where he served in World War I. Now, because of his experiences, he will lead to an admiration for the machine world and the mystical aestheticism that can be sussed out from the Neoplatonic approach to the universe, or trying to find the universal principles behind it. Now, according to Van Doesburg, rampant individualism and nationalist egotism actually caused the Great War, and he believed that we needed the opposite. Instead of an individualist, expressionistic approach to art, he wanted a universal language to reunite the continent. As he states, quote, "The old is connected with the individual, while the new is connected with the universal." So Mondrian and Van Doesburg are going to reject the expressionistic styles popularized up to World War I. Mondrian in particular will use the term neoplasticism to relate his rejection of these excessive decorative elements of pre-war emotionally laden complexity seen in De Broca and other expressionistic styles. Instead, Mondrian will practice a new type of non-objective art that radically simplifies the phases of Cubism. And this leads to a style that embraces only black, white, and gray, as well as the primary colors red, blue, and yellow. Additionally, he will only use restricted lines that are going to be either vertical or horizontal, giving us these colored squares in a very easily identifiable and graphic approach. Now, the interest in the repetitive ordering of design elements, especially by way of squares or rectangles in a grid-like pattern, is built into Dutch culture. Going back to the genre scenes we discussed with Vermeer, in this case Pieter de Hoek, and others, we always notice a repeated pattern of overlapping tiles and rectangles, in this case seen in the fireplace, the tiles on the floor, the picture plane itself is a giant rectangle. So we find these are always going to overlap. Thus the Dutch already have an innate interest in this, despite the fact that they're trying to make a universally applicable and appreciable style. Now, illustrating the process of abstraction leading to pure non-objective art is not going to start out that way. As Theo van Doesburg illustrates here in one of his most famous series, The Abstraction of a Cow, we begin with a natural form that they believe contains the essence of a universal harmony in this Neoplatonic fashion, that they will then fracture and reduce through geometrization to these essentials, to where we begin by breaking down the cow to triangles, rectangles, and cubes, then converting that to a coloristic design, and finally completely abstracting it, showing us what the final version would be, carrying this abstraction through to what appears to be entirely non-objective, but in fact still retains something of that universal essence of the world around us. And that is what the style attempts to do. Now, this is going to be heavily indebted to the reductive abstract principles of Cubism as founded by Pablo Picasso and George Braque. But we reduce it even further here to the most non-objective approach, limiting it to these universal colors where it does not reference the outside world or spatiotemporal collapse. Instead, we have the purity left over here from the primary colors and the reductive universal lines of verticals and horizontals in this architectonic composition. Now, the harmony of universals seen here can, of course, be related through these straight lines. Even though it is an asymmetrical composition, there is a harmony in the large red square coming out at us in the psychology of color being warm, whereas it is surrounded by negative space as we read it with the white, and then the cool color in the lower left-hand corner of blue. This is going to provide that reductive universal view of the world that anyone can appreciate regardless of where you are in Europe or what your background is. Now, this can also be applied in architecture, as Gerrit Rietveld is going to show us here in his Schroederhaus in Utrecht. So here, which can be seen on the train between France or Paris and Amsterdam, we have a structure that has been appended to a traditional Dutch town home, which is going to be made of brick. Now, the planes are also going to be restricted to vertical and horizontal, whereby we still have black, white, and gray, and restrict the colors used to yellow, blue, and red. All of this is going to be taken from the principles of the Stijl that are going to contrast this asymmetry in the overall composition with the harmonious primary coloristic relationships, here seen living in tandem with and in harmony with the older, more traditional living domestic quarters of the Dutch. On the interior, we find a conglomeration of individual planes pass through one another, as with the curtain walls of the Villa Savoyer of Le Corbusier. We find that we have a very modular design. We can move the walls to make an area a public living room or a private bedroom, a dining room, etc. This is all going to happen alongside the contrasting bold primary colors in an interior design that the practitioners and the designers hoped would spread throughout all of Europe, that would be appropriate for all nationalities and all peoples. Now, this interest in architectural design and of unity and utilitarianism is going to find its way to the heart of the Bauhaus manifesto in 1919, post-World War I. Out of the ashes, just as Le Corbusier had been practicing purism, and Van Doesburg and Mondrian the Stijl, Walter Gropius is going to found the Bauhaus in an attempt to fuse all of the arts together through architecture. Thus, he founds a design school that he calls the Bauhaus. Now, he collapses the existing fine and applied arts in Germany into the Staatliches Bauhaus, or the National House of Building, where students are going to learn the fine art principles of design and how to apply them in a useful fashion for, as Le Corbusier would say, building, say, machines for living in, or designing products we use every day, such as utensils and furniture. In this new school, we find that the aesthetic theory of fine art is brought together with the empirical knowledge of the applied arts. Thus, this is the foundation and the central core component for modern-day graphic design as we know it, where the Bauhausian axiom, form follows function, still holds true today. Here is the building that houses the school that Walter Gropius imagined would bring these two elements of the art world together. And he constructed it between 1925 and 1926. In the exterior, you can already see that it uses the domino construction system of Le Corbusier, whereas the walls are merely curtain walls and can be glass. The interior space, entirely functional and modular, can be rearranged to suit any day's work and or classroom function because the weight is distributed in the steel supports in the center of the structure instead of the walls on the exterior. Now, because the walls no longer bear the weight, the windows or curtain walls can open up and be placed anywhere. The interior walls, because they are also non-load bearing, can be moved, much like what we saw a moment ago in the Schroeder house, to any particular position to serve any function. Whether or not you want to open up a large area for a drawing space, close off a more intimate one, say for nude life drawing, and or open up large spaces for installations and or practicing modular architectural structures. All of it is possible in this very functional and utilitarian building. All of the classrooms still retained today, you can see, can close off from one to the next, or you can bring people together in one large lecture hall if need be for visiting lecturers. Now, this is the machine aesthetic of the Stijl, whereas we appreciate and embrace the modern architectural design elements of steel, reinforced concrete, and glass. And of course, we also are going to find that the sleek and flat forms overlap one another, much like those produced on an assembly line by a machine. So we find that utilitarianism is paramount in Bauhausian design. So this is the Bauhausian axiom that we have been discussing: form follows function. And that is to state that the form of a designed element should tell you what it does. It should inform you of the function. And we find that we have the wonderful axiom as well: less is more. We do not need additional decorative elements. We do not need anything additional here. We strip it down, whereas to allow us to build it up, to do more with it. Now, the designs that come out of the Bauhaus similarly are going to follow that minimalist axiom in products that are going to be designed here as well. The famous Vasily chair, for instance, by Breuer of 1925, using a minimal amount of materials for maximum comfort. Or the Marion Brandt coffee and tea service set here of 1924, also using that sleek machine aesthetic with streamline-like lines and smooth abstract designs. Turning to the style that will carry on the illogical, irrational, and anarchist style of Dada, we have Surrealism. Now, Surrealism replaces Dada because Dada had run its course. At the end of World War I, its entire point of being is to protest the war. Once there is no more war, the artists move on to do other things. And after they become disillusioned with the extreme iconoclasm of not making art that is permanent, that is meaningful, the practitioners turn to something that carries on their interest in the nonsensical and illogical, and that is the subconscious. So, written by André Breton in 1924, the first Surrealist manifesto will be inspired by the psychoanalysts Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, whereby, as Breton defines it, Surrealism is, quote, pure psychic automatism, by which one intends to express verbally, in writing, or by any other method, the real functioning of the mind. Now, what to take from this is especially the term psychic automatism, which reveals how they intend to show us the real functioning of the mind, bringing the inner and outer realities together. That is to state, they want to reveal our psyche, our subconscious, without having the conscious mind control it, to reveal what our subconscious is actually thinking and doing without trying to consciously dictate it. And this is where the difficulty arrives and derives from at first. Now, where does the surrealist interest in irrationality come from? From the same place as Dada, because they believed that it was rationality that put its faith in progress and science and technology and consciousness that caused World War I, that caused, once again, the collective mass homicide as these artists had seen it. So the salvation, as in Dada, would be in the illogical, the surreality, not reality. Right? So this is why you find surrealists will study criminal madness and the female mind, which both are seen as equally irrational in the in-between war period. So you find that they are still trying to ascertain what makes individuals act illogically or outside of the masculine norms, really, is what psychologists are attempting to do. Now, one of the first artists to show us the revelation through pure psychic automatism of the unconscious is Max Ernst. So a self-taught German artist, Max Ernst will serve in the German army during World War I and will practice the technique of frottage, which is an atomist technique whereby you automatically reveal something without consciously controlling it, whereby you'll rub a pencil or a crayon over a paper on top of an uneven textured surface. So here is an example of frottage, where you would lay it on, say, a rock or some organic structure, so that the revealing pattern happening here is not within the control of the artist, not within the control of the individual who is going to be letting it come out, thus revealing something uncontrolled and illogical. Now here is Max Ernst the Horde revealing another variety of frottage, and that is going to be grattage. So grattage is where one scrapes layers of paint over a canvas which is on a textured surface, thus revealing the imagery that appears in a psychic automatistic way, that being automatically revealing what the unconscious is thinking. So in this particular case, he goes back over these patterns revealed by rubbing paint over this uneven surface and revealing to us these monsters, this horde that's going to be moving towards us, much like a horde of zombies or the undead coming to devour us. All manner of creatures with various types of sharp-toothed mouth grins and horns and lumbering giants. Now, this is generally interpreted as the effects of shell shock as they understood it during the day, or post-traumatic stress syndrome, whereby the horrors of World War I are going to be externalized here. There isn't a way to directly express what he felt. And so we're going to be showing it in the automatically revealed psychic automatism. Another excellent example of surrealism, especially the former variety in which we have biomorphic surrealism and abstract shapes, much like we just looked at with the grattage of Max Ernst, is Juan Miró. Miró is going to be born into a goldsmith family in Barcelona, and then will go on to business school. But he has a breakdown in the business world, so he turns his attention to art school. Now, style is going to be the more common variety and less popularly known variety of surrealism, and that's biomorphic surrealism. So biomorphic surrealism is going to, using psychic automatism, make random shapes on the canvas, and much like grattage, fill in these randomly made strokes and shapes by the artist without consciously controlling his hand, just randomly making these motions, and then filling in to create these biomorphic or amoeba-like organic shapes. You'll notice here he's also going to draw faces on them to give them a more anthropomorphic interpretation, thus revealing what is actually happening in his subconscious. So we have, this is a great example of psychic automatism, in which we're revealing the psyche automatically without his control. And it's very much like the effect that is intended and hoped for in grattage by Max Ernst, whereby we'll reveal these abstract, nightmarish often looking forms, but still revealing more correctly and more truly the surreality of the subconscious, what is actually happening in the mind. And obviously, as seen here, it is generally going to relate, as Freud would say, to either eros or thanatos, the death instinct or the instinct to procreate. The more popular variety of surrealism that the public is more familiar with would be that practiced by Salvador Dalí. Now, a classically trained illusionistic artist, Dalí will graduate from San Fernando Academy of Fine Arts. He is going to be Spanish by origin and then moves in 1928 to Paris, where he met other surrealists, including, of course, his future wife. He practices what he calls the paranoid critical method, as he defines, quote, to materialize the images of concrete irrationality with the most imperialistic fury of precision, in order that the world of the imagination and of concrete irrationality may be as objectively evident as that of the exterior world of phenomenal reality, end quote. In other words, he wants to make the world look like you're seeing it through the eyes of a paranoiac, at the time what they would refer to as a schizophrenic, one who distorts the world, mangles it, and misconstrues reality to show us in a concrete fashion, much like a dreamscape, what our dream world really looks like, using phenomenal reality, or the same techniques that Renaissance artists would use for naturalism, such as linear perspective, atmospheric perspective, textural illusionism, all of these techniques. But instead of using it to show something from reality, Dalí is going to use it to show something from surreality. Now, please take a moment to watch the opening scene of Dali's short black and white film from 1929, An Andalusian Dog, and take note that it is an assault on visuality, forcing us inside ourselves as this man sharpens a razor and cuts a woman's eyeball open, thus forcing us inside of ourselves, inside of our dream world. Now, possibly his most famous work is The Persistence of Memory of 1931, whereby we're going to see the more popular variety of surrealism, as in the work here, The Birth of Liquid Desires. That's naturalist surrealism. Naturalist surrealism is going to incorporate all of those naturalist techniques that we're familiar with from the Renaissance, and is merely going to use it to show this dreamlike world. In this case, in The Birth of Liquid Desires, the fears of sexual intimacy that we all have. Now, the themes that run throughout Dali's works relate to sexuality, violence, and putrefaction. Again, the themes that Freud say drive human existence, eros and thanatos. In the work, we have, at the top right, a dresser out of which pours water onto a black slate, which funnels into a hermaphrodite's head, that being an individual with male and female sex organs. Down below, we have a massive yellowish architectural structure, which could either be the artist's palette or a woman's body, hence the large breast-like protrusion and then the orifice that a man is going to be putting his hand into, reaching into. And for Freudian psychology, buildings and then, of course, doors and windows relate to human orifices, and so entering them equates to sexual congruous in some way. Down below, a woman dressed as a bride with flowers in her hair embraces the hermaphrodite, while a woman shamefully pours water into a bowl where his foot is. This, of course, defies any rational interpretation. There is no story this is tied to. This is not from history. This is not from the Bible. We do not have recognizable religious iconography or imagery. Instead, it is intended to trigger primordial fears and anxiety and regression, whereby we're meant to think back, be taken back to childhood or an earlier state of our emotional and sexual development, and of course make us feel fearful because of it. Now, even though Dali represents the most popular variety of surrealism, at the time, in 1937, at the Surrealist exhibition, visitors selected this object as the quintessential surrealist symbol, and that's Merritt Oppenheim's Objet, or the luncheon in fur from 1936. With it, the artist has taken a teacup, saucer, and spoon, a popular object that everyone would have owned and had in their home at the time, and covered it in a deer pelt. Now, this object is not unique and made by the artist, but instead is mass-produced, is co-opted by the artist for a new purpose. Thus, we cannot view it in its original intended use and context. As with Duchamp's LHOOQ or his fountain, this is a utilitarian object stripped of its original function. Therefore, in a Dada sensibility, we are taking one thing and introducing it into a new context, forcing us to think of it in a new way. Just like Man Ray and other American surrealists would produce things such as Cadeau, seen here, which is an iron with nails soldered onto it. Thus, of course, we cannot consider it for its original function. It would destroy what it originally was intended to do instead of flatten it out. Now, the name for objet, or le déjeuner en forêt, is going to come from le déjeuner sous l'herbe, or Edouard Manet's Luncheon on the Grass. A famous realist work that's going to be very scandalous at the time, for it showed two semi-dressed or nude women with two clothed university students. A very scandalous presentation, as we have real people shown instead of goddesses or gods. Now, supposedly, this is going to take place or the origin of the idea for objet comes from a tea that Oppenheim had with Pablo Picasso, where it kept getting cold, where the artists are going to state that they would like it wrapped in fur to stay warm. Therefore, Picasso is going to suggest this, and Oppenheim then orders tea with a little more fur. Of course, anyone at the time looking at this might overlook the homoerotic sensibilities associated with it, for Oppenheim was a woman and gay. So this references cunnilingus, for you must imagine what you would put your lips up to that would be fur-lined and filled with warm liquid. So therefore, this is the most quintessential surrealist object, but not necessarily for the suppressed sexual reason that its audience might have thought. If we look at the disquieting juxtaposition that this forces us to consider, in that most people would not find it pleasurable to put the pelt of a dead animal up to their lips. So does Salvador Dali in his lobster telephone also suggest the same thing, forcing us to consider the subconscious desires associated with the objects. For with lobsters, it forces you to put your ear next to the sharp claws of the crustacean, and its tail is where it's going to keep its genitals. Therefore, that would be close to your mouth. Both of these objects relating to some type of fellatio or cunnilingus, appropriate for surrealism, hence the Freudian or psychological understanding of thanatos or eros being the dominant themes in art. Now, pleasure and pain seen here would, of course, both be attributed to the lobster, which, just like Oppenheim's, is going to suggest this rather sexual interpretation. Turning to World War II, leading up to it in the 1930s, we already can see the political and economic situation that will lead to it with a Great Depression. A Great Depression in America as well as in Britain and especially in Germany. Nearly 40% of Germans are unemployed in the 1930s, leading to the circumstances that made Hitler's democratic election possible. Now, the dress rehearsal for World War II can be seen in Spain, who will help Germany test out its weapons and weaponry before it actually invades Poland and then France. Here we have Francisco Franco ousting the Republican government in Spain, putting himself as a dictator in power. Now, in the Little World War, as it becomes known in Spain, there is a little-known civil war that's occurring here. The civil war is between the Republicans, those republicly and democratically elected officials in Spain, and Francisco Franco's fascist regime. Here we're going to find that to cleanse the ethnic minority in the Basque region of Spain, Francisco Franco will align himself with the Nazis to ensure his power. In 1937, he exiled the Spanish Republican government, and they then asked Picasso for a work to illustrate what is happening at the Paris International Exposition. Because there is a media blackout, much like now in North Korea, people did not know what was happening outside of the country, or let alone those outside did not know what was happening inside the country. Now, here we have in 1937 the circumstances set for a war crime where in Guernica, the capital of the Basque region, which is an ethnic minority in Spain, will be destroyed in an air raid on April 26th by Nazi bombers. Here is the very Henkel that was going to be used in these bombings. 7,000 civilians in the bombing alone were either killed or wounded. Now, this atrocity was not known outside of Spain because of Franco's fascist regime and him not allowing newspapers and or other media into the country. This leads us to Picasso finally producing a work to shine a light on these atrocities, otherwise known as Guernica, named for the very region that was bombed. Now, the work was exhibited in the Museum of Modern Art in New York until 1981 because Picasso would not allow it to return to Spain until Franco was out of power and the Republican government reinstated. The work, which is a massive 11 feet tall and 25 feet wide, is monochromatic and illustrates not in literal, but instead allegorical or metaphorical terms the atrocity that has occurred in Spain. Here we have the layout being comparable to a history painting. The significance relating to an episode from ancient history, contemporary history, or the Bible from academic painting. In it, we're going to find that Picasso will use his customary Cubist style now for political ends, showing us multiple sides of the same object, person, or animal at different times. Thus, the spatiotemporal collapse is now used to suggest the universal suffering of these individuals who were present and involved in the Guernica bombing. Now, according to Picasso's own words and his letters about this painting, we know that we have a woman in the right-hand upper section who holds a light illuminating the atrocities that are happening, as a woman on fire in the far right is going to be screaming, whereas a slain warrior and a gored horse make up the center of the image as he is speared with this wonderful spear that comes out of his abdomen. Off to the left, we have a woman that sadly holds her dead child screaming, whereas above her, a bull, according to Picasso, representing the brutality and darkness. And of course, this bull meant to represent Francisco Franco, who allowed this atrocity to happen, who brought in the Nazis to bomb his own people. Now, the monochromatic choice here, instead of a fully chromatic one to express, say, what has happened with fire and or blood, is going to make it more universal. That being, this is going to be the first person to express the horrors of World War II abstractly, but he will not be the last. If we compare it to Francisco Goya's The 3rd of May, 1808, produced in 1814, recording the atrocities of the Napoleonic armies, we have the same subject. In each one of them, we're going to be showing a war crime, an atrocity that has happened in a country against civilians, perpetrated against non-combatants. But now, with modern art, we are producing this subject and communicating it in an abstract way to make its universal suffering applicable to all peoples, instead of tying it specifically with dress, activity, or emotion to one nationality. This lecture will look at art in the later 20th century, specifically the rise of abstract expressionism as the capital of the art world shifts post-World War II from Paris to World War II, as we were introducing it last class with Picasso's Guernica, would be the result of a series of political events and Great Depressions that are going to be felt throughout America and Europe, whereby Germany is going to be the hardest hit, with 40% of Germans unemployed in the 1930s. This is going to leave open an environment rife for radicalism, and this is how Adolf Hitler rises to power in the 1930s. Now, by the time we get to 1939, Germany has already militarized and has invaded Poland. Britain and France then declare war on Germany for this act of aggression, and this sparks World War II. The Axis powers are going to be Germany, Italy, and Japan, who align themselves across Central Europe and then Asia, relating a formidable opponent for the Allied powers with Great Britain and Russia, because France is quickly captured by the Nazis around 1940, and then they try to push on through Great Britain. America would not join the war until 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now, when the U.S. joined the war, one of the bloodiest wars in human history, still we have not seen devastation and death on this scale. With 60 million people killed, 2.5% of the world population was killed in this conflict, this global conflict, which was much larger and grandeur, and is going to spread across the Pacific as well as the European theater and Russia. A very broad and a very devastating. Now, the war technically only ends with a dropping and then surrender in Japan of the two atomic bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man. Little Boy, the nickname given to the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and Fat Man, the one dropped on Nagasaki. Now, this new atomic power ushered in a new age of unprecedented military and thus established the Cold War between the United States and Russia. Here we find that a single weapon, a single bomb detonated, killed nearly 100,000 people each time it was dropped in these two major urban civilian areas, which is still a very complex and heated issue to this date, should the United States have dropped this bomb. 250,000 people were killed in order to get the Japanese to surrender to the Allies in World War II. The effects of radiation poisoning and devastation were recorded long after the initial date of their dropping on August 10th, 1945. We find that there are multiple burns and internal lesions that were not found until decades. Now, in addition to the new power of the atomic age, we also find that the psychological and philosophical effect of World War II, where 60 million people died, is going to also relate to the Holocaust, where 10% of those, 6 million people, died because of their religion, because of their race. And we find this type of ethnic cleansing is going to still sadly be true in certain areas today in the world. But the Holocaust, where 6 million civilians were rounded up and systematically murdered, is going to have a very, very powerful psychological effect and has people questioning the very notion of our existence. This leads to existentialism, or we should say a further investigation into existentialism, which is the philosophy questioning our own existence. That being philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre would postulate, there being these soldiers who fought in World War II, witnessing these horrific events firsthand, would ask, where is God? If God is omnibenevolent and omnipowerful and omnipotent, why didn't he step in and stop these atrocities? And so he echoes the philosopher Nietzsche's belief, stating God is dead, we killed him, and arguing that the world is meaningless and absurd, as would Dadaists argue, like Duchamp after World War I. But this is going to come after an even greater loss of life and an even more existentialist dilemma of our place in the world. Now, art at this time is an attempt to come to terms with what happened, and we find there are two directions for this. One is to try to, in realistic terms and expressionistic terms, explain how this made you feel. And the other direction is what we will look at in abstract expressionism, which is a complete denial of anything in the outside world, denying anything bad had actually happened. Francis Bacon represents the former of these two directions art will take. He's a self-taught British artist, and he acts as an air raid warden during World War II. And of course, he states that art is to come to terms with the horror of war, stating, quote, I hope to make the best human cry in painting, to remake the violence of reality itself, end quote. In his art, we see the effects of what he witnessed during the summer of 1940 in the Battle of Britain, where we find that VR rockets and bombers are going to be used against the civilian population in England, which is not unique. We saw that with Guernica and these other areas where civilians were targeted, much like the Holocaust. Luckily, the RAF, or the Royal Air Force, was able to hold back the Nazis during this period, and they could not cross the English Channel. But witnessing the horrors, the mangled rubble and bodies that would occur as these bombers would come in and he would sound the alarm, right, obviously had a toll and took a toll. In Francis Bacon's art, we see that he is demonstrating the perceived effects of the atrocities he witnessed during the war. Here, with Head Surrounded by Sides of Beef from 1954, we have one of the quintessential Baconesque works where we have an ecclesiastical or religious leader seated inside of a black box, two sides of beef beside him. This is actually going to be based on two very famous works that the Britons would be familiar with in the royal collection. We have Diego Velázquez and his portrait of Pope Innocent X, originally painted in 1650, where we find this potentate is going to be seated on this throne with the red velvet and then the white lace of the delicate sleeves. Whereas Rembrandt's The Slaughtered Ox is a very straightforward painting of a slaughterhouse. Placing both of them together, we find a man now howls into this black abyss as though no one can actually hear him, whereas these sides of beef enclose him. They close in around him in a claustrophobic fashion in this box, to where we have this butchery happening in nothingness. And if we cry out, no one will hear us. So this type of existential angst is what is generally felt in Europe and reflects this destruction of Europe's infrastructure, to where the Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill, is going to very aptly wrap up in the statement, "What is Europe now? A rubble heap, a charnel house, a breeding ground of pestilence and hate." As we find the rebuilding is going to take its toll on the citizens, and certainly the hope for the future and the willingness to work together had been stretched to the brink and broken between these countries. Now, the art world, because of these difficulties, will shift now. Paris no longer has the resources, nor do we find that they have the artists or intellectuals. Instead, we find that they all fled during World War II, finding safe passage, and then finally making their way to New York, which, of course, European critics are going to claim is when America stole the idea of modern art. And in New York, we find that the teachers, the philosophers, the artists, all of these individuals who may have been of Jewish heritage or would have challenged the socialist agenda of the Nazis, found their way to a more tolerant land. Now, it is here that we find the art czar, right, as he is nicknamed, Clement Greenberg, emphasizing the final stage of what modernism will come to be known for. And that is that World War II accelerates this move away from the objective and the realistic, and accelerates an interest in formalism. So modernism, that began with the movements of realism and impressionism, would find their final phase here in abstract expressionism, which is defined by an emphasis on the visual elements instead of the subject matter. So we find that formalism is the most important thing to consider when attempting to understand the tenets of abstract expressionism. In the 1940s, abstract expressionism will be known as the New York School. So the New York School of Painters is going to be based in New York City, where we find a number of these European refugees and American artists are working side by side. Individuals like Willem de Kooning, who is a Dutch expatriate coming from Holland and settling in New York. In his series of Woman 1, we're going to find the first variety as we're moving from the abstract yet still recognizable objects from the everyday and or the subconscious to complete non-objective abstract. Now, in his series, we have photographed here him working on this massive work. We find that de Kooning is attempting to capture what Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, referred to as the collective unconscious, that being tapping into this ocean that we all share of the unconscious, and that each individual is going to be an inlet from this ocean. So we all share the same anxieties, fears, and desires according to Jungian psychology. Now, in order to capture it, he uses the process that surrealist artists did as well, and that's psychic automatism, whereby he's to reveal his psyche or unconscious mind automatically by making these random, uncontrolled gestures on the surface of a canvas, and then going back and revealing through gestural abstraction, recording his gesture, what is actually happening in his unconscious mind. So this is the first variety of abstract expressionism that is practiced, in which we attempt to record the gestures that artists are making, first with their hands and then with their whole bodies. Now, if we compare this to Juan Miró's composition in biomorphic surrealism, the effect is going to be quite similar, in that we are using these generic and uncontrolled motions of the artist's hand, not attempting to make a particular shape or very carefully define or refine something, but instead letting it reveal itself through these random motions. And whereas Miró is going to reveal biomorphic shapes with these tiny faces on these little amoeba-like forms, Willem de Kooning is going to reveal the form of a nightmarish yet inviting woman. So through psychic automatism, we are revealing these universally recognizable images from the collective unconscious. So what is woman according to de Kooning, according to our collective unconscious? What does it mean to the male? Well, the first thing that is defined as womanly would easily be identifiable as these pendulous breasts in the center, which would remind one of the fertility images like the Venus of Willendorf, where we find the parts of the body emphasizing femininity are going to be the very engorged breasts, large abdomen, hips, and thighs. So first and foremost, fecundity and fertility would define in Jungian psychology what. Now, secondly, the face is Gorgon-like, and you find the pose is as well, with the torso seen from the front and the legs seen in profile. So, moving back to Greek mythology, woman as something threatening in this way. And certainly you can tell that with the hooves of this woman, to where she is not even humanoid in the form from the legs down, but instead much like a goat or another quadruped, she has. Now, we find that the smile, this grimacing smile, would be seen everywhere at the time in popular advertisements in the late 1940s and early 1950s, especially relating to Camel cigarettes, where doctors would promote the act of smoking as a way in which to calm irritation, and that would be beneficial to one's health. So the smiling woman, this grimacing and inviting yet threatening smile, would be seen ubiquitously in advertisements, in magazines, and in billboards, and on TV. Finally, we find there is a brassiere and high heels added to these hoof-like examples here, and that relates to the 1940s pinups, very popular among, say, soldiers in World War II, and continued into the 1950s, a very popular body kind of pastime of the poster pinup girl. So again, we have something that relates to fertility, yet is simultaneously threatening to man. Now, if you look carefully, the painting has been painted over several times, repeatedly, over 200 times, according to the artist's wife, in 2 years that it took him to complete this. So he's trying to remove his consciousness, that being his willfulness in deciding when the work is completed, and instead lets it be finished by accident or by the unconscious through psychic automatism, scraping off what has been there and painting over it to where he removes his conscious control of the. Now, the paint looks a lot like the expressionistic use of paint by those in Die Brücke and other expressionists, as we looked at with Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, for instance. And that is one of the ways to understand abstract expressionism. It is using the brush and gestural abstraction in an expressionistic way, recording how the artist felt about something, and eventually turning to pure emotion and pure feeling here shortly. Following de Kooning, perhaps the most famous abstract expressionist is that of Jackson Pollock. Now, thanks to existentialism in World War II, this philosophical system, which questioned our existence and meaning in the world, will push artists further towards formalism, leading to an entire detachment from social and political concerns, until finally we are focusing solely on the medium, solely on paint itself. So artists turning further inwards in abstract expressionism will eventually completely deny the outside. Now, Jackson Pollock, born in Wyoming, would be considered and was written about in the 1950s as the quintessential American cowboy and modern artist, bucking tradition and coming up with a brand new way in which to apply paint. Now, he will die in a car accident at 44 years of age, due largely to his alcoholism, yet his impact is monumental. He's going to be nicknamed by Time magazine Jack the Dripper because he will practice a form of abstract expressionism that still captures the artist's gesture. However, in the case of Pollock, it's going to capture his entire body's motion as he dances around the canvas instead of actually putting a brush to the canvas. Now, his master is Thomas Hart Benton, who's known for massive mural paintings, and in the 1930s is hired by the Public Works Administration under Roosevelt to make these massive murals with his apprentices, such as Jackson Pollock, around the country. So we find that in them, you'll notice the undulating composition is going to be very influential for Pollock, as he will adopt the same type of undulating snake-like rhythms as we move through the composition, up and down, forward and back. They're not straight lines in a Thomas Hart Benton. Now, Pollock, like de Kooning, goes through an early surrealist phase where he's attempting to express universal symbols through gesture, and pure psychic automatism in this way is how he develops the mature phase of his art that we are so familiar with today. But earlier we can certainly see the affinity between a de Kooning with the abstract shapes yet still identifiable subject matter of a woman, and then that of the she-wolf here by Pollock, still trying to reveal the collective unconscious. Now, turning to Pollock's mature phase, we have a new style that attempts to unleash pure psychic automatism and ensures that his mind cannot control how the painting finally appears because it is not even touching the canvas to the In this new technique that is nicknamed action painting, Pollock is going to take buckets of house paint and drip it on the floor as he unrolls pure canvas in his studio, which is his barn in upstate New York. So in this, he dances around in the rhythm that captures his gestures here. So the canvas with the unprimed weave is going to soak up several layers, usually 3 distinct levels or layers of paint, from dark to highlight, as he builds it up, as it records his gesture. One can see in his Autumn Rhythm number 30 this mature style and what gestural abstraction or the specific type of action painting performed by Pollock looks like. In the standard canvas size that has been unrolled here, we have 8 feet 9 inches tall and then 17 feet 3 inches long, to where he would dance around and around the form of the horizontal canvas and then decide, sometimes rather arbitrarily, where the painting began and ended. Now, in it, we have 3 distinct layers or levels of this webbing, recording how he's moving and dancing about the surface. Beginning with the black paint, right, setting the ground plane, then the lighter brown or taupe, and then finally a gray and a white on top, thus giving us this depth to this completely non-objective or abstract painting, communicating pure psychic automatism, or what the subconscious actually looks like. What is in the collective unconscious? Obviously, it is not something that can logically be talked about, nor in this gestural abstraction, we are still recording the gestures of the artist, but now we do not have the brush applied to canvas. Now we are recording the gestures that his body makes as he moves around and around, dropping and dripping the paint as he goes. This is going to lead us to completely non-objective art, where he is not beginning the process of abstraction with a landscape or, say, a cow, as Theo van Doesburg did with the Stijl we looked at last time, but instead is entirely non-objective. There is nothing that is referenced in the outside world. No formal representation is going to be necessary, for it communicates the power of pure psychic automatism through the artist's gestures. Now, Pollock is going to die rather young when he's 44 years of age in 1956 with his mistress in the car, who survives. His widow, Lee Krasner, also survived him, handling his estate, a successful painter in her own. Now, Helen Frankenthaler is another practitioner of abstract expressionism who lives in San Francisco, and beginning in the 1950s, she will be included in Clement Greenberg's Abstract Expressionist Exhibition and Retrospective in 1964. She practices another variety of abstract expressionism, and that's going to be chromatic abstraction. That being, instead of recording the artist's gesture, we're going to have large chromatic planes of color. Now, she's going to be the presidential appointee to the National Endowment to the Arts that will side against controversial artists in the culture wars of the 1980s. She denied funding to artists who proposed something that was controversial. Therefore, she is herself a controversial figure in the art. Turning to her examples here of chromatic paintings such as Mountains and Sea, even by the title, we are going to be suggesting a landscape as the subject. In it, we have several gestural abstraction motions with this graphite drawn on the surface of the canvas that outlines or contains these large areas of color, made not by the artist's hand applying it, but instead through her pouring the paint onto unprimed canvases. Thus she would pour it and then tilt the canvas to get it to run in the direction she wished. Thus, as it seeped into the weave, it appears much more like the saturation of a watercolor painting than a traditional acrylic painting that would have been on a primed gesso background. Now, in it, we still seemingly will have these abstract designs or elements, but now the primary focus is not on the violent activity of the artist's body moving around and around the canvas, but instead the large flat areas of color or hue as they spread out, much as water and watercolor saturating, once again, a background. They now are going to, in a very soft and delicate fashion, spread out across the canvas. Possibly more famous for abstract expressionism and chromatic abstraction is that of Marcus Rothkowitz, more popularly known as Mark Rothko. Now, we have this Jewish Russian who immigrated to the US right before World War I, when it was a good time to leave Russia. And like Pollock, he's also going to begin with a surrealist style, but instead of focusing on the gestures of the artist's hand and or his body, he will use color as a transcendent vehicle to put forth a contemplative mood in his viewers through rectangular shapes and vertical formats. His type of chromatic abstraction will become known as color field painting because he paints fields of here in Lavender and Mulberry, the title of the painting being Colors Themselves, we have a standard Mark Rothko composition, which is a vertically oriented canvas that is rectangular, with again a background or imprimatura layer of a dark solid hue, in this case lavender. Now on top of it, he paints squares and rectangles of brighter and darker hues, darker chromatic tones here, in the hope of looking at the abstract designs and then communicating or understanding the supernatural or sublime behind it. Unmediated by a recognizable subject, Rothko would hope that you would stare at this composition until you noticed the soft edges of these squares begin to radiate, hover on top of, and or move behind the flat hue that covers the surface. In this instance, color is going to be able to communicate meaning, pure meaning or ideas itself, without the intermediary of, once again, so the subject and how we're meant to understand it, the content in the painting, if you will, is going to be the same as that of Friedrich's Monk by the Sea, to where we contemplate the vastness of nature and thus are going to understand the sublime nature of the supernatural and God, as we stare into color as a pure vehicle for communicating meaning. Now, how this is meant to be appreciated can be communicated by looking at the Houston Rothko Chapel, which is aptly named a chapel. Thus it is a religious structure, this octagonal structure, whereby you walk in a dimly lit room with seemingly large uniform paintings on the wall, and the longer you stare at them, allowing your eyes to adjust as you meditate or pray, you realize that in fact they are not flat or dark areas of color or black paintings, but instead they have subtle transitions between these lavenders, violets, purples, much like the lavender and mulberry we looked at a moment ago, realizing that they are going to be subtly different. The difference is made possible and noticeable only if you are going to release your mind and allow it to wander in a meditative sense. Thus, color becomes a communicator of pure meaning and or emotion. Now, this is the difference between gestural and chromatic abstraction, whereas abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock will record the gestures of the artist's body or hand. Those chromatic abstractionists like Helen Frankenthaler and Mark Rothko are going to communicate meaning by way of pure color in these fields or patches of color. Now, we find that Rothko will be diagnosed with an aortic aneurysm, and instead of his family watching him descend slowly to death, he overdoses on antidepressants and slices his wrists. That's how he dies at the end of his life. Following the color field painting of Mark Rothko, we have the next generation that takes the edges of the organic chromatic style of Frankenthaler and Rothko and is going to do away with the human touch altogether in a new type of chromatic abstraction known as hard-edged or post-painterly abstraction that completely removes the artist's hand and expressive content and ability. quality. Another son of Jewish immigrants, in this case from Poland, we find Barnett Newman being one of the most famous practitioners of this new abstract expressionist approach. Here in his Vir Heroica Sublimis, or the Heroic Sublime Man of 1950 to 51, we have a rectangle that is horizontally formatted. Primarily a warm red hue dominates the surface, with lighter, brighter, and darker sections or stripes situated throughout. Now, Newman is going to describe these stripes as zips, where he paints a color underneath the surface of the painting and then puts masking tape over it, removing them after he has completely covered the surface with another hue. Thus, the lines that we see are devoid of human touch, of human emotion or content. We read the painting solely by way of the color and then the undulation, that being the white section comes out at us, whereas the dark sections move away from us. So we have a type of oscillation on the surface. Now, because he entitles the work Heroic Sublime Man, we are aware of the fact that we're supposed to think of Native American art. And in fact, this design is taken directly from Native American art, specifically from blankets of the Navajo and other tribes, whereas these areas of black and white and red in this fabric are going to communicate, according to Newman, the tragedy of Native American peoples that were relocated and moved on to reservations after the colonial enterprises of European. Now, in this instance, you completely deny the interpretation here of the artist having to do with the construction of the painting. Instead, it is much more like a machine has produced it, completely denying the artist's hand and fulfilling that prophecy of Clement Greenberg of formalism, that being art in abstract expressionism seeks to reveal what it is made of, that the formal elements are paramount and do not attempt to make the work look like something it is not, instead highlighting what it is made of, and that is paint on canvas. So this is the farthest we can go with modernism, completely denying the outside world, and now completely denying that an artist had to do with the creation of this canvas. Now, this is going to be a type of painting that is largely overlooked because of more colorful characters like Jackson Pollock, who was an alcoholic and was quite abusive, until well after the death of Barnett Newman. At that point, his works are going to find a resurgent popularity. Now, this type of approach with abstract expressionism can also be carried out in sculpture, as David Smith is going to demonstrate in his series of Cubi here from 1963 to 65, where we find multiple geometric elements or shapes are going to be welded together on a cylindrical or triangular pedestal. So in sculpture, we find that these will be inspired by Picasso's sculpture, which he puts together with an acetylene torch from industrial materials. So we have an industrial technique, putting together industrial materials that reveal the forms that they're meant to represent. So we're not trying to make Smith's abstract sculptures here look like a biblical character, say of David, or of a mythological figure of Hercules. Instead, it represents what the forms are, and that is going to be a series of metallic geometric forms welded together and burnished in order to catch the light at different angles, right, as it shines. So here, this is going to be seen outdoors, if intended. The markings, the gestural markings from the burnished surface would reflect and refract the sun's light and show you the irregularity of them, just like the gestural irregularity of Jackson Pollock's rhythmic and whiplash-like designs in Autumn Rhythm number 30. Now, this is why Smith is going to be considered the father of minimalism, a style that follows abstract expressionism and attempts to dematerialize the art object, while at the same time highlighting what it is made of, what the formal elements and qualities actually are. Now turning to, at the same time, abstract expressionism is going to be denying the outside world, so too do we find that the international style of architecture makes its way into the American lexicon of architecture. Here we have Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson in the Seagram building in New York, and the integration of new skyscraper technology with steel frame construction that becomes very popular in the 1950s. So in areas like New York, where there is not enough space to build outward, we find that urban crowding forces architects to build upward in high-rise buildings or sky. Now, with steel frame construction, we have a structure that shows us all that is necessary to understand it, in that it uses steel, reinforced concrete, and glass as the modern architectural building materials. And so that is all that we see here in this towering structure of steel and reflection. In Mies's axiom, which would align with the Bauhausian axiom of form follows function, he stated that less is more, thereby reducing to the necessary components only that which needed to be shown. Thereby, the interior floor space is going to gain height, and the austerity of design allows it to be much more functional, whereby we can make different levels, that being set aside for office buildings and or businesses or domestic structures, all of which made possible thanks to the curtain wall design going back to Le Corbusier. Now, if we compare this to the Woolworth building by Kaz Gilbert earlier in the century, the same architect as the St. Louis Art Museum, we're also going to find that Mies, van der Rohe, and Johnson are going to strip away the veneer, strip away any historicist references. It does not look like a Gothic cathedral. It does not have additional sculptural ensembles on the exterior. Instead, we are denying any historicist elements. It is what it is made of very clearly. The formal elements being steel and reinforced concrete and glass, and that is what we. So in the same way that we are denying the ornamentation and decoration in abstract expressionism, we're doing the same thing in architecture, completely denying that it references anything outside of itself or from past traditions. Next time, we'll continue on with the style practiced by younger generations in the 1950s and 60s that are going to grow weary of the denial of anything on the outside world, and they want to bring back into this popular lexicon all of the nomenclature of popular culture, thus elevating to the level of high art that which is common, such as comic books and